Any sufficiently advanced technology is indistinguishable from magic.
But I want to welcome today Dr. Leonard Mlodinow, whose books have been entertaining me and educating me for many decades now. I first read your book on Feynman. I think that was one of the first books I read by you, at least. And today we're talking about the book that's behind me and behind Leonard, and that is Stephen Hawking, a memoir of a friendship in physics. And I want to welcome you to the Into the Impossible podcast, Leonard. Thanks for joining us.
Oh, happy to be here.
So you are known for many things. You're a theoretical physicist in your own right. You're an author. You've written many books, two at least, with Stephen Hawking, and now this new book, so The Grand Design, of course, runaway bestseller. A Briefer History of Time, which maybe we'll have some chance to talk about. You wrote Subliminal, which won the PEN Award, and also War of the Worldviews with a friend of mine, Deepak Chopra. And one of the questions I'm going to talk to you about is these interesting collaborations that you've managed to put together for yourself, and advice for people like me when asked if why I go on, and do interviews with Deepak Chopra or somebody else. Not to mention the fact that he's one of the endorsers of Frank Wilczek's books, who I've had on my show. But they'll make fun of him for not being a scientist, and why should I, give credibility to that? I want to talk about that later. But first, I want to just read a quick blurb about the essence of this new book, of your book about Stephen Hawking, and your friendship and your collaboration together primarily on The Grand Design. And the statement that I have here is that you are able to put the reader, and I agree with this, into the room where it happened, in the words of Alexander Hamilton, if you will, for sharing these intimate moments of a friendship that in some ways, sometimes we note as scientists, we spend more times with our collaborator and our students than we do with our spouses or children. So I want to commend this book to people that are interested in seeing scientists as human beings. I often joke, I've used this joke too many times, but a scientist is outgoing when he or she looks at your shoes when he talks to you. But you're much more gregarious and extroverted than that. So anyway, thank you for doing that. I want to also begin where I do normally. I ignore the advice to not judge books by their covers. I first and foremost judge books by their covers and their titles. How did you come up with the title and the cover of this particular book?
Well, we thought long and hard, and as you know, it's not the most creative title. So, what was left when, as Sherlock Holmes would say, when all other things were ruled out, was what you might think is the impossible. Let's just call it Stephen Hawking. I tried to come up with something, and sometimes when I write a book, it's interesting. The title shouldn't mean that much, but you feel like it does. And I don't know, you attribute later after the fact that people, like the book, remember the book partly because of the title. You don't really know if people like the title. You say, "Wow, that was a great title." If it turns out they didn't like the title, you say, "Yeah, I had a crappy title." But actually, you don't really know what effect the title has on a book. And I love Drunkard's Walk, which I wrote, which is about how randomness in the world affects your life, and how much of your success and even just wherever you are in life is due to random events, and that how hard it is to recognize, realize, and appreciate that. So we called it the Drunkard's Walk. As you know, the Drunkard's Walk is another word for random walk, in a mathematical term where something is just moving and changing directions randomly. Yeah. And my publisher hated the title. They said, "Who knows what the Drunkard's Walk is?" I said, "Well, it's true. They might not know what the Drunkard's Walk is, but once they hear it and they find out what the book's about, they won't forget it because it's kind of a nice, it sticks in your mind." They wanted to call it The Power of Probability.
Oh, yes. Must read.
That sounds like a must read, right? And certainly in hindsight, people like the cover and they like the title. And in this case, I was trying to find something like that where I would have a term or a phrase, like for example, "theory of everything" would have been great. It would take it. So I couldn't find one, and I wanted one that would once you may not know immediately what it means, but once you said it was Hawking, you would remember the title.
Yeah.
I just couldn't find anything that was, not misleading or obscure. And in the end, we just said, let's let the subtitle say it all, a memoir of friendship and physics. And that's what it really is. That's what it's about. I wish I could have called it a memoir of friendship and physics, subtitle regarding Stephen Hawking. But they wouldn't let me do that.
I was jokingly going to suggest, it's the most provocative of all your titles, most controversial, the grand design. That didn't cause any controversy whatsoever.
Right.
Or the War of the Worldviews. It actually reminds me of this book written by an up-and-coming author named Galileo. And of course, the title is evocative, or your book with Deepak is evocative of this, dialogue concerning the two chief world systems. But I don't know if you know this, that wasn't Galileo's choice. That was his publisher's choice, or at least the pontiff's choice that was acting as the provider of the imprimatur that allowed him to publish this book in the first place. Galileo wanted to call this book On the Flux and Reflux of Tides on Oceans and Ferns. It's just like, oh, you can't put that down. That survives A/B testing and whatever. So our friend Galileo, so the Pope actually, ironically, did him a real solid favor by making him change the title to The Dialogue on the World Systems, which is much more evocative. So your publishers sometimes know things that we don't know as often.
Yeah, I think he surprised the Pope with the contents too.
That's right. Yeah, and he kept it up. And his next book was also a dialogue, The Discorsi. I want to go to a part that the only encounter, I only met Stephen once. I was at Caltech for many years when he was there and when you were there. It's a shame I never met you there as a postdoc or met Stephen, but I did meet him in the early 90s, mid 90s, my first trip to Queen Mary College, as it used to be called. And that was when Stephen spoke, quote unquote, at the Royal Academy meeting. I believe it was 95 or so. And there was a question and answer period. And you very tenderly and lovingly describe how challenging, how it would have driven you mad, it would have driven me mad. The modality of communication he had was so torturous. But I remember somebody asked him at the end of the talk, and they said, Professor Hawking, you're so brilliant. You wrote A Brief History of Time. It's reputed that the ratio of people that have bought it to people that understand it is almost infinity, because nobody understands it who reads it to good approximation. Why did you write this incomprehensible book? And this young person asked Stephen, and 10 minutes go by and he's working out the answer. This is when he could still move. I think he could move a finger at this point in the early 90s, but you'll know better than I do. But and he answered, I wrote it because I had to pay for my daughter's college. And everybody laughed. It's kind of a cute line. But in reading your book, I realized that Stephen was a very practical person, and in a way that many of our colleagues are not. And actually, I think of him now after reading this as kind of the CEO of Stephen Hawking Enterprises, that he was an entrepreneur. He had a brand, obviously. He cultivated that brand, and he had a monopoly on that brand. Talk about Stephen as a businessman, which is a dimension of him that I never knew until I read your book.
Well, it's interesting. He didn't start out that way. In the early 80s, he had the idea of writing a popular science book on cosmology. And one big aspect of his character was an evangelist for science. He truly wanted to spread the word, and the scientific way of thinking really bothered him in his later years. For example, all the anti-science in the U.S. And so he was going to write a book for the Cambridge University Press, which your viewers may not know the ins and outs of academic publishing, but the Cambridge University Press, they were offering him $25,000, which was huge at the time. That was huge, and it would have probably sold about 25 books. And he would have had very little editorial help. He would have had very little marketing or no marketing. And he had agreed to do that, and actually he had agreed to it. It was waiting to sign the contract when where was it now? The New York, was the New York Times, I guess, did a feature on him. And that, no one really outside of physics knew him before that. Not a lot of people knew him after. I mean, they did. It was just a feature. It wasn't like he got set. His image, his brand was set on fire. But people in the know, people in the intellectual circles really paid attention to that. And one of them was Al Zuckerman, the founder of an agency, which is now my agency that I'm at, the Writer's House. And Al said, "Wow, this guy, this guy is great. He could, he loved the." Based on the profile, he just loved Stephen's character, that he seemed to be adventurous and outgoing and evangelical, and the fact that he was in a wheelchair. So Al went to him and said, "Hey, don't sign that contract if they give it to you. Let me see what I can do about this book." And he got $250,000 for that, which would become The Brief History of Time. And I think just as important, more important than the money, is he got Bantam as the publisher with a brilliant editor named Peter Guzzardi. And Peter deserves a lot of credit for that book because Stephen's writing was, first of all, it was all over the place. Some parts were as if you were explaining it to I should say an 8th grader, a 6th grader. And parts of it were good for his graduate students, and everywhere in between. And parts of it, when you're a physicist, as you know, it's hard to get perspective. You sometimes are so in love with some ideas and so passionate about them that you think everyone will be interested in. And so there were parts that were overly technical and so forth. And so Peter worked very closely with Stephen to make that book a success. And
yeah.
Around that same time, which is why it seems like he just wrote that book because he needed money, but he was actually interested in that. But around that time, he got one of his really bad lung infections. And every year he would have a lung infection or two, and often in the hospital. And when I knew him, it was almost a yearly occurrence that he's on his deathbed and you're worried for him. It was very, very common because when you have ALS, your lungs aren't that active. And so things have settled down in there. And he had, to breathe through, later in life, through a stoma, a hole in his throat. And around that time, 1985, he had this very severe problem, and in order to survive, they had to make that stoma, which meant he couldn't speak anymore. And it also meant he really needed round-the-clock care after that as he was going further and further downhill. And that is what caused his need to be a businessman to start Stephen Hawking, enterprises. So it was kind of a confluence of the fact that he had this opportunity and that the book took off, and he had this need. And so what he did was put those two together, and he realized that he needed to keep his brand and his career going just to afford to live, because a normal person in that situation that he was in would be in a home. And they would be in a bed somewhere, maybe in a room with other people, maybe not in have a private room, and you wouldn't have nearly the stimulation, the access, or the life that he was able to have by having people, carers, who could take him around places, who could travel with him, where he would have access to physics documents or people to turn pages for him, which they were doing as the electronic age came, to the equipment that he could actually read online and so forth. He would have just been, more or less, unfortunately and sadly, warehoused there. And he would have, I'm sure, died much sooner than that, because he would have no real reason to live. Yeah. And as it was, he was still able to do physics, to participate, to be a leader in the field, and to have this public life with his writing. And that's really what kept him alive. That's what gave him the spirit to keep living. A lot of the mortality from ALS is partly physical, and partly because the person loses the desire or the will to live any longer. Mm-hmm. And to fight through all those infections and to have the care that kind of minute care. I don't want to go on and on about just one example. Every night when he slept, he had to have his stoma cleared every so I forget how often it was, every hour or something, or they would have to suction it out. He would suffocate. Mm-hmm. They had to turn him because he couldn't move. So if you lay in bed in a certain position, not only does it become painful to you, that's why we turn around at night, but after a while you develop bed sores and you blood clots and all sorts of things. So every couple hours they would turn him. Now, it wasn't very pleasant for him because he couldn't turn when he wanted to. If he wakes up like we do and there's an ache, you can't just turn on your other side. It was almost like torture, but he was kept alive because they would do it periodically and it would keep bad things from happening. So yeah, he saw that he needed that, and he put all that together and made a business out of it.
There's a old joke, not to have too rugged a segue, but there's a joke. Jerry Seinfeld, talks about like the reason that old people drive so recklessly, and they back out of the driveway, they don't even turn around because I've lived this long. The hell with it, I'm going to go for it. But it kind of made me wonder. He had a lot of, gumption, or as we say, chutzpah. He had, he certainly had no fear, I think, of, as you recount in the book, when you yourself were quite trepidatious about asking for a doubling of your advance on a contract that was imminently going to be signed. I wonder, do you think that stemmed from having overcome this annual battle with brushes with death, or do you think that's just the way he was? And even if
he was a brash guy. He had chutzpah. I mean, that's his physics is all about that. Like, you look at what he did. He did things that people didn't think of doing or thought couldn't be done. When he came up with the Hawking radiation and the black hole evaporation, he went and spoke in front of a pretty hostile crowd, and he could have just published it quietly in Nature and let people read it and draw their own conclusions. But he went up there and before it was even published and told people about it and took, faced the music. And so with the advance, I think at some point, I'm not sure why he had agreed to the advance that we had, but it was not just about to be signed. The contract had been signed. And one day he just tells me, I'm going back to New York, like I was in Cambridge working with him. Tell him I want to double the advance. I go, well, we have a signed contract. I don't think you can do that.
That's
and
right.
He's like, just do it. And when I went to, the stories in the book, but when I went to tell Al, who was still Stephen's agent, about it, my agent came with me as moral support. It was quite a scene, because Al was a old time, everything's a handshake kind of guy, and everything's done according to honors and convention and tradition and honesty. And he was very much against it. He was very much against it. But if you read the scene, you'll see how he did turn around, and of course they did it. And the way book advances work, in case your viewers don't realize, is you get a royalty on every book that's sold. So Steve and I would get a royalty, and the advance is you get a certain lump of money. And so as the books are sold in the beginning, they don't pay you. They just take an accounting until you get to that amount they give you in advance. But it's not just an advance; you get to keep it even if the book doesn't sell anything. But the point is, if a book sells a lot, it doesn't matter, because it'll go past the advance, and it doesn't matter whether you got it in advance or you got it when it did the sales. So I'm sure the publisher felt that was fine, but they agreed to it. And when I went back and told Stephen, I thought I'd get a good job, good work, or was it hard? Did they fight? But he just went, yeah, of course they did.
He just expected it.
yeah, I'm Stephen Hawking.
Well, talk about your own chutzpah at a certain point in the book, which I found very revealing about the true level of intimacy that you guys had. Because if it was someone like me working with him, and I find this with Stephen's was the late Stephen Hawking's great friend, Sir Roger Penrose, who's been on the show many times, and we'll get to, and hopefully in a few minutes. But when Roger comes up with something and I think it's out of left field, sometimes I feel reluctant to criticize him, because of how much he means to me. He's the first book I ever read in popular science. He endorsed my book, and so I'm more reluctant. But talk about the time when you really had to slightly gently upbraid Stephen, and it's a very tender scene in the book that I found very revealing of your own courage to gently rebuke one of the greatest living scientists.
Well, I guess you're talking about the scene where we had been apart for a while, and he had, the way we worked was we first spent about a year designing what he called the plan for the book, like a beat sheet if you're a screenwriter, or the chapters, but what's in the chapters, and debating it endlessly back and forth. I thought we were never going to stop. And then one day he just said, it's time to write. Okay, we weren't finished with it, but whatever. We started, the way we did it was he's taking certain sections to write, or certain parts, certain passages, and I'm taking other ones, and we would each do our own. We would talk about it, then we would separate. He's in Cambridge and I'm in Pasadena, and we would do our own parts. And sometimes we'd email back and forth, and then we'd meet again. He would spend about 3 or 4 weeks every year at Caltech, so it was right next to my office, so I would see him there pretty much day and night. And then I would go to Cambridge and see him. And so we would trade what we did, and then we'd sit side by side and go over what he wrote, what I wrote, and so on. And one time, when I'm meeting him and we're supposed to be going over it, I realized he hadn't done anything. He hadn't done his part, and he hadn't read my part. And it was like, I had another book. I think, what was I working? I think it was Subliminal, about the unconscious mind. I had my own physics research. I had a lot to do on my plate, and I'm feeling like stressed out trying to get my part done. And then I come to see him, and tra-la-la, it's like months had passed and he hadn't done a thing. So I was, as I described in the book, I was a little nervous about bringing it up, but I felt I have to bring it up because I couldn't not bring it up, because how could I keep working this way? I mean, either we just say, let's not work, or we have to both do things. I know the one thing that wouldn't happen is I just finish it and he says, fine. Because if you read the book, you'll see that no, every word he would debate.
Even the last straw. Well,
right, that's the last straw, exactly, literally. So anyway, I waited till we were alone, and I brought up the courage, and I confronted him with it, and I had no idea how he would react. I think in the book I said when you have a relationship, say a romantic relationship, or a relationship with a really good friend, one of the key things about the relationship is not that you never have conflict, but how do you handle it when you have a conflict? So I thought, right. I'm going to see. And actually, it was great. He was not, he could be very gruff and very rough on a person with few, like.
He didn't suffer fools lightly.
Yeah, if you're not getting it, if you're stupid, or if he believes something very strongly and you disagree and don't come along with him, that would also be a time, or but in this instance, not at all. He totally understood what I was saying, and he admitted it, and he apologized for it. And he said he had kind of a crisis of not knowing, even though we had the plan and we spent the year on it. What is the book really about, and where are we going with this? And so I guess he had a kind of, I don't know, it was writer's block, or maybe never even sat down to have writer's block. It was simply avoidance, because he didn't feel inspired. And in physics and in writing and in other creative things, you kind of need to have the craft that you do it day to day, but you also need the impetus to spend that time sitting there and working like that. And but then we had a talk the night before, and we had worked some things out. So he said, I think I get it now. I think I have a vision of it, and I'll be better. So luckily, that worked out okay, or we probably wouldn't be here right today.
Right. And so now getting, to Stephen a little bit more intimately, I find, some of the arguments, the conclusions that Stephen, I never realized it, actually, honestly. So I'm reading a book now by a Christian apologist that his name is Dr. Stephen Meyer. I think he's either runs or affiliated with the Discovery Institute, which is intelligent design, essentially. But he has he wrote this book called Darwin's Doubt. You may have heard of it. And in that book, he spends a lot of time talking about Hawking. And so I went back, because he's asking me, what are my thoughts on it? Can he come on the show? And I hope to have him on the show. He's actually asked him, does he have questions for Leonard? So I'll ask you his questions, but they're basically ones you would expect about the multiverse, et cetera, which hopefully we'll get to. But in any case, I never realized how much of a polemic, in some sense, A Brief History of Time was about perhaps, first of all, the singularity work that he had worked on in his PhD thesis, popularizing that, but really confronting this notion of God. And you talk about this in Stephen, in the current book, in your memoir of friendship with Stephen Hawking. And you talk about, he was of two minds. I mean, he was certainly, as we said, he wouldn't suffer fools, but he would, on other occasions, you say that he would say things like, religion is for people that are afraid of the dark. And some of his romantic, partners, I can't remember. He had so many, some were married, some weren't. But some of them were deeply religious and some were not. I think his first wife was religious. Is that right?
Actually, his first wife, his second wife, and then his girlfriend at the end, they were all deeply religious.
Yeah. So he didn't want to insult them, but and of course he's too smart to say I'm an atheist, and he was very almost apoplectic at the criticism that he got. Oh, he's just dumping on God, and the Catholic Church was very upset about him. But in reality, I think his views were kind of clear in that I don't think he believed in God. It doesn't mean that he would be like a Dawkins, a militant atheist, but necessarily. And I think he thought that was a mistake to act in that way towards believers. But nevertheless, my sense is that he definitely didn't believe even in the God of Einstein, the pantheistic Spinoza God. Why didn't he make that more clear? Because I want to be careful not to ascribe, like a venal motive, like it would hurt book sales to say that God doesn't exist. But it seems so clear that a lot of his work was predicated, at least in the singularity work that he worked on, and in the grand design, obviously, that God, the personal God, that was a non-existent concept for him.
Right. So first, I guess I should say, it's funny that just to go to something he said toward the end about whether he was not talking about his atheism because he didn't want to hurt book sales. He's been criticized for that. He's also been criticized for the opposite,
right?
For talking about atheism or implying atheism to help book sales. And I think these ad hominem attacks that people make on him are ridiculous. And I knew him, and I know what he was thinking, so I'll tell you. But let me also give you a little data. When the Grand Design came out, I was walking my daughter to school. Olivia was like in, I forget, second, third grade or something. And I get a call from Judith, Stephen's assistant. It's whatever time it is there. It's the evening, I guess, and it's early morning here in LA. And I need help answering. I need help with these reporters. I need help with report. What's going on? I mean, there's no reporters here, and the book had just come out. And she said, oh my God, every news organization in the world is calling me, and Stephen can't handle it. You have to answer the questions for him. She said, haven't you seen it? Haven't you seen the Times? And I go, the Times?
The LA Times, the New York Times?
The London Times. I said, who reads the London Times?
I'm a daily subscriber.
And the headline is Stephen Hawking, there is no God.
Right. I remember that.
Our book became #1 immediately on the New York Times bestseller list. So in terms of, hiding the atheism to help book sales, you could argue both ways, but in that case, it certainly helped the atheism help book sales. Not that people both atheists and theists bought the book because the controversy helps the book sales. And we were condemned by the Catholic Church, by all sorts of people. And I'm turning on pretty soon ESPN, and then it's some kind of sporting event going on, and they start talking about my book. And I'm, oh my God, if ESPN, Men's Health Magazine interviewed me. I mean, it was like, so I don't know. Anyway, it's kind of silly to say he did one or the other. What the truth is that he was an atheist. And yet he went to church. He went to church with his wives. He respected their belief, their church.
He's buried. His funeral was Westminster Abbey, right?
Right, and his interment, his funeral was at the church. He even, I heard the story of a time where he actually was brought to tears by the sermon and the music at the church. So he was not anti-religious at all. And he told me once. It was a little bit after Dawkins' book came out. What was it called? The God Delusion.
Yeah.
That he did not want to be like him. He did not want to insult people, his wives, his friends, or anybody out there, who believes in God. So that's why he tended to keep that to himself. But what he wanted to do, and he said, our book is not an argument against God. Our book says you don't have to have God. Okay, the universe can come from nothing.
Right.
And the laws of nature can be explained in the way we did in the Grand Design. But it's not to say there isn't a God. We don't prove that the non-existence.
Yeah.
You just say that we don't try to prove anything. We just try to say what science says and let you,
yeah. It's funny, Leonard.
He was critical of the church when
Sure.
we talk about Galileo's time, for instance. I mean, it's not like he thought that all that was okay. But he wanted to present the science, and he wanted to know for his own edification, why are we here? Where did we come from? How did the universe get to be the way it is? And those are the answers he wanted to present. And of course, religion has the same question, so they have two different answers.
Right.
He didn't have an axe to grind one way or the other.
Yeah, so I think about him as a deeply devout agnostic in a sense that I'll make clear, and I feel that way about myself, although I do practice Judaism. But you probably know, being culturally, at least biologically Jewish as well, the word Israel in Hebrew means struggles with God. It's very different than Islam, which means submit to God, and obviously Christianity just is named after Jesus Christ. But Israel means to wrestle with God, literally to fight. I mean, there's a scene in the Old Testament where Jacob is wrestling with an angel of God. But not only that, it means to every day really fight with this notion, or take the notion of God seriously. In that way, I think of Stephen as like an Israelite, somebody who struggled constantly. He never dismissed it as a folly or a stupid question like Lawrence Krauss might, or a Richard Dawkins might, that it's child abuse, and certainly wasn't acerbic about it. But since he's not here, but you are here, I've always been fascinated by your views on it, because as I say, I know that you're culturally Jewish, but I don't know what role it plays in your life, if any. That's not that important to me. But what I'm interested in is, this notion that I observed myself when the Bicep 2 experiment, when we released our results in 2014. Stephen Hawking gave talks about it, pointed to it. It's amazing, with the laser pointer. And he, gave a talk in Cambridge about this. And it often seemed that he was a little bit overtaken by the power of these ideas that he had. And let me give an example, like the singularity theorem. I've had this conversation in the last month or two with Lenny Susskind, with Sir Roger Penrose, and with Frank Wilczek, and many, many others. About whether or not, the notion of a singularity even should be taken seriously in the following context. We don't believe there are naked singularities that you can observe or witness, to Sir Roger's chagrin. And so these singularities are forever firewalled off in the case of black holes by an event horizon, as Stephen worked on with Sir Roger. And then in the case of the Big Bang singularity, that is also outside of our cosmological horizon. As close as we could possibly get to it is perhaps the inflationary epoch that I study observationally. But the question I have for all these people, and I want to ask you as a physicist, now forget about Stephen for a minute, but do we have any reason to believe that a singularity is real, or is it merely the consequence of extrapolating general relativity to its ultimate conclusion? Do we have any reason to think that a singularity actually exists?
Wow. Okay, that's quite a question that could be answered on different levels. And I know you want to know, asking me, not Stephen, but I can't. I still hear Stephen in my head.
Yeah, I'll take both of you guys for the answer.
In the grand design, we wrote, and of course the new book is about that process. And I talk about how at one point we had this little discussion where he had told me that he wants to write about a new philosophy for physics, which answers questions such as you just asked. And then he also said, in some prose that he sent me, he was going to write philosophy, used to explain the universe, but philosophy is dead. And I said, well, how can the book be, first of all, how can a book be a new philosophy for physics? And then we say that's the philosophy, that it's dead. And I said, plus you're going to insult a lot of philosophers, and they may not be doing the philosophy of, they're not natural philosophers who are trying to explain the origin of the universe. They're doing ethics, or they're doing the philosophy of language, or whatever. So let's not make a blanket statement. And then we had this kind of argument where he says, yes, but your sentence has no punch. And then I would argue some more, and then he'd say it even louder, and I finally gave up because I thought it was going to hit me. So we've said, that philosophy is dead, and we did get a lot of flack, especially from philosophers. And
so he was okay pissing off philosophers, but not theists. That's interesting.
Yeah, that's right. Well, so and I think as I said in the book, when I finally said we're going to get a lot of flack, we're going to get. He just smiled, and I think he liked that idea. So. But his philosophy, what it was, addresses questions like that. So he recognized that in physics, like with the multiverse and with singularities, we have our theories bring up phenomena or situations that are not observable, and we know that physics is about observables. So how do we reconcile that? And the idea is that a theory has to be testable, certainly, And so it has to give some predictions that weren't there before, and you test them and you find that it works and it fits all that. If it has other predictions like a singularity or parallel universes that are uncoupled that we can't get to, that's not bad. That doesn't, it's not like saying our theory makes no predictions. That's not the same thing. Theory makes predictions that we can confirm. It also makes other predictions that we can't confirm. And so, okay, that's okay. So the question is, now you talk to a philosopher who says, what does that mean? Like you just did. And this is what his model-dependent realism was. You know, he was also recognizing that, so he said, look, to understand what this means, you have to realize, first of all, that we can have multiple theories that describe the same thing, right? For example, just take quantum theory. As you know, there's different formulations of quantum theory. There's the more standard ones that came up in the 30s from Schrodinger and Heisenberg, and forget about which picture you take or which interpretation, whether it's the Copenhagen. Just look at quantum theory as it was invented, and then you look at Feynman coming in the 40s and a totally new formulation of quantum theory that looks at it differently, right? Feynman, so the original one is based on all these waves, matter and energy waves and uncertainty, and his is based on the fact that he says that the history of any situation, the unfolding of events, there's not a unique unfolding of events in the quantum world. There are many or infinite occurring kind of at the same time, and when you make an observation, they all affect what you're measuring. It doesn't matter with the details, but there's two different pictures of the world, and it's been proven that they give exactly the same predictions in all cases. So they're equally good, but do you think of the world as having all these multiple histories in parallel, or do you not? Do you think of it the other way? So Stephen was saying that that you have to recognize that a scientific theory should not be taken literally, and so if we say but being very practical, he says, don't even ask if there's an objective reality out there, okay? Because we know that our theories are filtered and formed through the brain of the human, and that in itself imposes certain orders and certain concepts. And aliens with a different brain, or a frog, if it was smart enough, with its architecture of its brain, would have different theories. And we believe in the end that all these theories would agree on their predictions, but through the uses of different concepts. So depending on which theory you use, you can picture it in your head as being real. But is a singularity real if you can't get to it because of the black hole horizon? He would say you may as well think of it. He would say think of it as being real, but be open to a parallel theory where they don't exist, and just be happy with that. So that's why he called it model-dependent realism. So he felt that you kind of take it as being real, but you realize that it depends on your reality, depends on your model.
Yeah.
So, in a way, it's in between. I talked to philosophers about this who weren't the ones who weren't throwing stones, and they said that there's a philosophy called realism, and I'm not a philosopher, which is one reason neither was Stephen.
Yeah.
We didn't really want to write about. I didn't think we should write about this too much, but anyway, there's realism, which says people think that the laws of physics are describing something that's really there, that's concretely, and they are just a description of it. And then there's anti-realism, which says that the theories that we make are kind of all in our head. They're a way of our dealing with the sensory input, and there's no deeper meaning to them than that.
So if I could interject just an example. So I often say, have you ever seen a triangle? Well, I mean, I can conceive of a triangle, but I've never seen a triangle that has three zero-dimensional points, right? So is that an example of anti-realism, essentially?
So this goes back to Plato, right? And Plato said that we there's an ideal world, which is the real triangles where the lines have zero width and the points have zero dimension, right? And then there's the real world, which is what we're confined to perceiving, which are, let's say, triangles drawn on paper, which are some kind of approximation of these ideal forms, right? And so so I think the anti-realist would say that a triangle is just a human imagination, and doesn't reflect anything in the world deeper than that. Whereas a realist would say a triangle is maybe an idealization, but it's an idealization of something that's really there. So, like the Matrix, take the Matrix movie, right? That is a good, let's say, illustration of what could be the truth, right? I'm not saying that I believe that it's the truth, but look, we don't know the difference. We can't tell, are you really there? Or I could just be a brain floating in space, Boltzmann's brain, you may remember that story. Yeah. So I might be a brain, and all the experiences that I'm having, which have come through my own senses and are perceived by my brain, don't really exist. They're all a big dream that I'm having, or I'm in a computer or something.
Yeah, Descartes, right? The brain in a bottle. Yeah.
Descartes said, "I think, therefore I am." But I think so. So he's saying the only thing you know about is that you exist, right?
Yeah.
So.
And then, of course, I felt like Descartes copped out because he appeals to God and the ultimate extension of that. But I guess with physical, so a triangle, I agree. It's not something. It's almost immaterial if it exists, or if it's only a concept. I had a conversation with Jim Simons about, is math invented or discovered? And his answer is basically yes, both. But in the concept of a physical quantity, I call this the hard problem of singularities when I talk to people about this. And that's, a physical quantity like temperature, density, or mass, infinite cannot be infinite. And then like Zeno's paradox, how does it taper down to be a finite value? A minute after the Big Bang began, if it's infinite, how could it be a finite temperature? It's Zeno's version of Zeno's cosmology.
But as we know, that's all fine mathematically. So, 1 over x at 0, it is infinity. Anywhere away from 0, as soon as you get as little as you want, it's finite. So.
Right. And that was what sort of I felt like, just again being, and it's unfortunate Stephen's not here, but I felt like at certain points he would say it's almost immaterial if it's really a singularity or if it's essentially the Planck length. And you guys discussed this a little bit, but he discussed this in the structure of space-time with Ellis. And, but I think that's the key nugget, is if it really is 0, how does time progress infinitesimally before the universe itself exists, for example, is a big question. But really what I want to get back to is more not the specific details of even what you believe, but the notion that what you talk about in the book is that, Stephen says a law is not a law with God. In other words, if you have to appeal to God, here a miracle happens, kind of that Sidney Harris cartoon. If you have to appeal to God, it's not a branch of physics. And yet he then went on, kind of modus ponens, to say like, God has 2 roles. He basically can establish the initial conditions of the physical state of the universe. And then he can also choose the laws of physics. And that's really his only 2 job description, on his job card. Those are the only things God is necessary for, at least in the physical world. We can talk about personal God some other time, but he seemed to view himself and his work on singularities with Hartle, or rather in the no boundary proposal, as eliminating the need for the God to choose the initial conditions at all, because the universe basically is responsible for its own initial conditions. The thing I always wonder about, and I've had this debate about Lawrence Krauss's work, when we say, well, the laws of physics allow you to extrapolate back from GR to, in the Vilenkin theory, you can extrapolate and you can prove there's a, geodesically incompleteness at a point in time. And that means that any expanding universe had an origin in time, essentially. But where did the laws of physics come from? That's the big question that I, it's, Sean Carroll, I've asked, he says it's a Hilbert space, but where does the Hilbert space come from? I find it's a lot of hiding the ball. So I'm curious, where do you come down in this? Where do the laws of physics come from? It's a simple question.
Stephen considered that his first book, A Brief History of Time, was explaining the initial conditions of the universe. And that's the no boundary proposal that he worked on with Jim. And Jim is sensitive about this. Jim Hartle, key person in that, not a flunky of Stevens, but equal in that theory. Yeah. So if you're watching this, Jim, because people have a tendency to call it Stevens no boundary, but right. That was the piece of his work, by the way, that he told me he was most proud of.
Yes.
So,
Mm-hmm.
and then, so the first book, Brief History, was that. Of course, he wrote some other, like Universe in a Nutshell. Those are all, and when I wrote with him, the Briefer History, those are all reworkings of
Yeah.
Brief History.
Mm-hmm.
But then we wrote a totally new book, The Grand Design, and that answered the other question: that book was an answer to where do the laws of nature come from? And his answer was the answer of M theory, really, that there are, depending on the geometry of the vacuum, the topology, there are different laws of physics. So Stephen felt, based on his work with Jim Hartle, that the universe creation, which no one can deny, was a quantum event, right? And when you put it together,
well, there are those that do dispute that. So Paul Steinhardt, Neil Turok, Roger Penrose.
That it was a quantum event. I mean, the quantum theory applies, right?
Well, no, they say that the bounce in at least in the bouncing cosmology of Turok and Steinhardt and Aegis, now there is a purely classical transition through the bounce. There's no quantum phase of the universe.
Okay, well.
And then Sir Roger just has these eons that
expand.
Is
that a semi-classical, or is that? I mean, there's a classical phase where there's no Planck's constant. Is that
in which in Penrose? I don't think Penrose featured.
Penrose, his work was classical, but I mean, you can do it classically. Certainly, Stephen's early work was just classical, and then he applied quantum theory. And then, since we don't have quantum gravity, you do semi-classical approximations. But anyway,
right.
Stephen was saying that you have to look at the universe like Feynman, it's quantum theory like Feynman did, and the universe has multiple histories, right? And what that means, a history, if you're in a laboratory and there's a particle going from A to B, the history is its path,
right?
But if you're looking at the universe, the history of the universe is the states of the universe, and that to him that includes the laws of nature. So the laws of nature themselves is
an element of a Hilbert space.
Yeah, an element, right. So there are multiple universes developing, each with different laws, with every possible set of laws. Okay, so in M theory, they're out to say there's a landscape. There's all these possible M theory versions of M theory. Which one is it? His answer is they all existed. They're all there, and in the quantum group of parallel histories in the Feynman sense. I'm trying to not to be too technical, but he's saying basically that the universe began in every possible way, and some of the universes allowed inflation, and they lasted for a finite long time, and we could have stars and people develop, and some recollapse right away, and some have this law of physics, some of that laws of physics. And some very small fraction of them have laws of physics that actually enable life to develop, which we can talk about later if you're interested. But that's a very interesting
definitely
thing that most, if you just change the laws of physics by 1%, 0.5% here and there, and you go through the evolution of the universe, you'll find that life could not have developed. So there's a very special set of laws.
I do want to talk about that, just to put a pin in that, because there is modern work of Fred Adams in the University of Michigan, and even Lord Martin Rees, who I talked to earlier this week, with Mario Livio. They are seeming to suggest, and I believe what you just said to be true, but they are suggesting that the envelope, the parameter space, is far wider for the evolution of stars of massive gravity, of electronic chemistry, et cetera. We can talk about the quadrupole and the CMB. They're suggesting, Fred Adams in particular, that our universe isn't particularly finely tuned. But I don't want to take away from what you're saying, because
but there's been a lot of work, so I don't know. I didn't do the work, so I won't debate them on that. But I've talked to Stephen about that, and some of that, like, I remember it's in the book. But if you change the mass of electron by 0.5%, I mean, I'm not necessarily talking about not having stars develop, but you need a lot more than just having stars. They have to go through and have a supernova. They have to have the heavy elements created, and they have to be dispersed. There's, you change the strong force by a little bit, and protons become unstable, and they decay too fast for any of this. I mean, there's all these very intricate things that have to happen for life to exist. There's the
there's one parameter that
And
depends
the
on the
level of
fine,
the carbon atom have to be just right, right?
right.
There has to be a certain resonance.
The Hoyle
Yeah,
resonance.
Hoyle's
Right?
right. I mean, there's so much, and I don't know. Like I said, that's not my field, but we looked at that, and Stephen pointed me towards certain books. But I don't follow the. You know, there might be other work recently that's questioning some of that. So I don't know. But yeah, it's not just though the development of stars, but um, yeah.
So yeah, I want to just so uh okay, so I'm not going to pull any punches with you because I have so much respect for you, just like you had respect for Stephen Hawking, and you didn't pull punches with him. In fact, you held his hand, as we talked about earlier. You far from, punched poor Stephen. But, it's far from being true that string theory, let alone M theory, has been, validated or verified. Some say it's actively been refuted. I mean, there are people that say that M theory and string theory in particular have held back the progress of theoretical physics for the last 50 years. And these aren't like Shelley Glashow has said, so
I know I've used to have just talks with John Schwartz at Caltech. Who's one of the founders of string theory.
So how could Stephen, so I understand that
John, I think, resented the fact that Stephen for years was not a believer in string theory. And I think it was the M theory work by Witten that really convinced him. And we talked about that many times, and he felt that string theory, that M theory was correct. And I have not seen anything that look, again, just like you talked about the fine tuning, everything in physics is always being questioned.
Yes.
And you can go to certain websites, and it's almost like there's a revolutionary breakthrough every week, and then we forget about it next week.
Right.
So, I say that's fine tuning. You say, these people say, M theory. Then people say no M theory. Yes, everything is in flux, and there's camps on both sides of almost everything because science is like that. Not that science stays like that. Eventually, it gets settled.
Right.
And in the case of M theory and string theory, I certainly haven't seen anything that would convince me that it's debunked. On the other hand, I haven't seen anything that would convince me that it's bunked.
That's right. That's the latter. I'm not saying that's been
agnostic, but I working with Stephen, I took his point of view and it was writing about helping him and working with him to write about his ideas.
Mm-hmm.
And I felt that I certainly didn't feel that he was misguided. I just felt that people can certainly legitimately have doubts. And I have to say, for my own personal self, we wrote the book 10 years ago, and the last 10 years, in my opinion, has been pretty depressing for the string theory, M theory crowd. Yeah. And from my point of view, are pretty, let's say for me, pretty surprisingly uneventful in terms of progress. And so I don't know. I think Stephen believed it till the end, which was just a couple years ago. But
yeah, it's interesting. Now I'll ask you in a couple minutes, and I have my closing questions that I ask all my guests. But one of the questions is hearkening back to Sir Arthur C. Clarke's 2001, A Space Odyssey, in the Kubrick movie, when these hominids encounter this obelisk on the plains of the savannah of Africa, and they hit it with a bone. And later on, this obelisk appears on the surface of the moon, and it's supposed to be like a time capsule. So I'm going to ask you later. So I'm giving you a little homework assignment right now to be multitasking, as I know you're so capable of. And I asked all my guests, what would you put on a monolith like that could last for 1 billion years? And I asked this of Kamran Vafa, who is one of the most preeminent theorists of any kind, but string theorists in particular at Harvard University. He was on the podcast last week, and you can watch his answer. And he says he'd put on it the equations of string theory. And I'm thinking, as I'm interviewing, I just love him. I just love him so much. I can't I can't take him down. Like, what are you talking about? Why would you do that? And only analogy I can make is like, if you ask me that question, Brian, what would you put on your monolith to last for 1 billion years? And I said, I'd put the bicep 2 results, which is like, we know that it's at least as likely that it was contaminated by dust as by revealing the presence of primordial gravitational waves from inflationary origin. So it just seems strange to me that so many people put so much stock in something, so much so that I feel, and again, I can't armchair analyze anybody, but that Stephen, was kind of taken by the singularity, no boundary proposal with Hartle, and kind of almost like confirmation bias. He wanted to, he was so proud of it that he felt like it was true, even though as we both said, it's not clear if such a question is even well posed to verify or falsify the existence of an actual physical, not mathematical, physical singularity, and to validate or bunk or debunk, as you said, M theory. So it's these two things that he built such a huge edifice on. To me,
to go back to what you said before, and to be clear, also on Stephen's no boundary proposal, it's not universally accepted, certainly.
Yeah.
So I guess I should have started all the things that I've been saying. This is the frontiers of physics. So everything I say,
it's provisional. Yeah.
There's another side to it. Some things are maybe 80%, people believe this way. Some maybe 30%.
Yeah.
But we're not talking about stuff that 1% believe. So Stephen's stuff was mainstream, but it's not. It's far from. And that was something we struggled with in the book too. Is like, how many disclaimers do you give? I mean, you don't want to have a footnote by everything you say and say the other side says this.
Yes.
So you say what you believe, and hopefully it's clear that these were Stephen's theories.
Yeah. So before I close with those final questions, I would love to do a part 2 just about the grand design, because there's so much there, and Feynman and Euclid's rainbow. I always get your Feynman and Euclid's
rainbow and Euclid's window. Yeah.
Okay, I always mix those up. So thank you. Yeah, I'd love to do a part 2 someday.
A memoir similar, parallel to this, but about because I happen to be blessed to know Richard pretty well.
Yeah, that was the first book I remember reading. That 2004. That was probably the first book I ever read by you. Okay, but before I do the final questions, which I ask all my guests, I want to ask a question that only you could answer, which is on a personal level, which was more, I would say, more depressing to you when you finished the grand design, which you must have known would probably be one of the last books you'd write with him, or last collaborations you'd have of him, or after he died? Like, which was sort of a more final or more jarring to you emotionally event in your life and platonic love affair with Stephen Hawking?
Well, when he died, I mean, I actually, came to tears. I don't know why. It's like everyone knew that I knew he was gone downhill and he was sick, very sick. And he also knew the whole time I knew him that could happen any time. As I said, he had brushes with death every year. And yet, because he had brushes with death every year, you feel that he's immortal, because, the first time he has a brush with death, you get worried. And then you start going, oh yeah, these things happen. So, hopefully it'll come through, he'll be okay. And then eventually you go, oh yeah, well that's just Stephen. That's nothing. It's like, and as I alluded to, I had a brush with death during my writing of the book. And I remember laying in the hospital bed going, oh my God, he's going to outlive me.
He's going to outlive me. Who would have thought?
Who would have thought that he's going to look for someone to replace me on the book instead of the other way around? So, I thought I just didn't feel, it wasn't real that he would ever die, and so that was quite it was one of those things that it doesn't happen very often, but like you wake up the next day and you go, that didn't really happen, did it? But I think he was ready to go, and I talked about that in the book, and some of his encounter he had near the time that he died, and he seemed to be ready to go. And I always felt that his purpose in life was accomplished when we wrote the grand design, because he had two questions that he had really drove him and fueled his will to live in a way, in some way at least. One was how did the universe begin, as you said, and the other one was, where did the laws of physics come from? Those were the how do we get here, basically, questions. And so the first one was a brief history, and then in the grand design we really crystallized his answer to the other question. Now, so I felt like when he was in his 20s, he had found a purpose in life and a reason to live and a reason to stop goofing off, because he was a goof off until then, which was to answer these questions. And finally, in 2010-ish, he realized that he had the answer, and then we wrote that book.
So I lied when I said that was my last question about Stephen in particular. So I want to ask you on my father, died about 14, 15 years ago. And I was taking care of him, and I was, getting ready, taking care of kids and so forth. How was it with you having young kids? And basically, you were literally a caregiver for one night of your life, at least, which was very harrowing, as you'll read about in Stephen Hawking, A Memoir of Physics and Friendship. But how was it balancing these two needs? I mean, you have this little kids, and you're off going to Cambridge and working with him, and he's coming there. And how do you balance those roles of kind of taking care of a parent and taking care of kids?
Yeah. That's hard. I mean, everybody who's, I think, a professional who's, overworked, or even actually not a professional. So many people in this country are overworked. I lived in Germany for some years, and in Bavaria and Munich, and they get, I think, 16 holidays a year and 6 weeks of vacation on top of that. And here we all work constantly. So I think it was hard. You don't get sleep, or you feel guilty a lot of the time. When I'm with the kids, I'm thinking I better get some work done. When I'm working, I think I should spend time with the kids. I always put the kids as my priority, though. Yeah. And so I would, that was the two things I did. And I would, pass up whatever just to spend time with them when they were growing up. And then I would just say, well, I won't sleep tonight. I can get my work done after that.
Wow. And then the last thing is, this happens to me often with my late father. I'm like, oh, I got to tell Dad because and then I'm like, he's not there. If you could get a text message to wherever Stephen is right now, what would you send him? What would you want to tell him about the books or his work or physics in general? What would you want to send to him if you get that one-way text message?
I was going to say, I wouldn't send anything about here. I'd say, you tell me.
No, it's one way. No. Or he says, it's very hot where I'm. No, I'm just kidding.
I think that I would just say, hey, Stephen, guess what? You were wrong about something, because you're getting this message from me, and you've been dead for a few years, and P.S. I love you.
That's wonderful. Okay, Len, thank you so much. I want to ask you the 3 questions I ask all my guests. Sometimes I make it 4 questions when I'm talking to like a financial advisor or a psychologist. I'll ask them to unify gravity and quantum mechanics in under one equation, and they what are you talking about? But actually, I'm going to skip that one because I know you could do it, but there's not enough room in the margin of this conversation. But I do want to ask you something that relates to the religion of Judaism, but it actually applies to everybody, including Alfred Nobel, as you'll understand in a second. And it's about an ethical will. So Alfred Nobel, when he died, he left a material will. He had no kids. He had no wife. And he left almost all of his material money to go to this Nobel Prize, which I stole from Frank Wilczek last week. No, it's a piece of Hanukkah Gelt that has his image on it. But it's a notion that you can also leave ethical values. And in Hebrew, it's known as an zava'ah, an ethical will. And Alfred did that too, because he required that the things that were rewarded with the Nobel Prize be given to those inventions or discoveries that had the greatest benefit to mankind. And first of all, do you feel Stephen should have deserved a Nobel Prize alongside of Sir Roger? And then second of all, what would you put in an ethical will encapsulating your wisdom for your biological, but also your ideological children?
Well, I think that Stephen felt that he would not get a Nobel Prize because Nobel Prizes are generally almost exclusively given to theories that have been experimentally verified. And it was a big surprise when Roger got it. And I think that if Stephen were alive, that he should have gotten it with Roger, but they can only give it to 3, so God knows how they would do that. And I think the Nobel Prizes are, often unfair. Let's say.
Yes, someone should write a book about that.
Yeah, and and there's a scene in the book about Stephen and Nobel Prizes, but ethical will is interesting because I did write one. My rabbi, when the kid's first child, Alexei, was born, asked me to write an ethical will. So I don't remember. He's 30 now. I don't think I kept it.
Go ask him.
My ethics have left me.
I hope you don't do that with your crypto coin that you leave to your kids.
Yeah.
Don't lose the wallet.
My real answer would be I'd have to think about that, but I can give you a superficial answer, which is, I think that The Hippocratic Oath, I think that's part of it, but one of the principles of medicine is to do no harm. And I think that's what you should live your life. First of all, do no harm.
Very nice.
And secondly, try to do whatever good you can. But first of all, do no harm. and thirdly, have a good time. But obey 1 and 2.
That's right. Don't forget the fourth rule is don't forget 1, 2, and 3.
Yeah.
Okay. So the second question that I ask all my guests relates to Arthur C. Clarke, and that's the monolith question. So is there anything in the laws of physics, as Feynman, you know for sure, because you wrote about this in Feynman's Rainbow, Feynman had the so-called cataclysm question, which is if in some cataclysm, all of scientific knowledge were to be destroyed and only one sentence passed on to the next generation of creatures, what statement would... So I want to ask you if you could put some statement on a monolith and that would be launched into space. It's funny, I did this with Ann Druyan, Carl Sagan's widow, and she said, I did this on the Voyager 1 record, golden record. It has my brainwaves, and NASA launched it on a 4 billion year journey to the stars. But anyway, what would Leonard Mlodinow, what would you put on a monolith to last for all time, essentially, or to communicate discoveries, something brilliant about humankind?
Well, I guess that what I would, I would recognize, I would put down something recognizing that our knowledge is provisional, that Newton thought he had the answer, and he didn't. Maxwell thought he had the answer, and he really didn't, because then Planck came along, and then, we keep revising our answers. So I wouldn't, Feynman answered that question with the atom. He said, the idea of the atom is the most important, idea. I don't know how you state that, so what I would say to them is, here's what we know now, if I could get that. And I would put down Maxwell's equations for light, and then I would put down non-relativistic quantum theory, or maybe relativistic quantum theory. I don't think I would put even QED. Because guess what? QED is a asymptotic. It's non QED. It has mathematical issues.
You'd stop at the Dirac equation.
I would stop at the Dirac, or even before that.
Schrodinger.
These are the principles we've discovered as of now. So you'll know what we believe now. And I wouldn't go as far as the QED, which is the for people who don't know, it's the quantum electrodynamics, the theory of the quantum theory with elementary particles being created and destroyed, electrons and positrons and so forth. And that works extremely well to 12 decimal places, etc. But we know that mathematically it has issues. So I wouldn't put it there. Yeah. I would stop at the last place where we're pretty solid. I certainly wouldn't put strings. I don't want to put things that we're speculating about. But these are the things that we feel we know. They're probably wrong too. but this is where we are now. And good luck. And if you're so friggin' advanced, I want you to find me in my death 4 billion years ago, or in heaven somewhere, and tell me what the final answer is. That's what I would
They'll reconstitute you in their cosmic Bisquick. Yeah. They'll have some Bisquick out of you. My thing would be don't eat me, or go somewhere else. But that's an actual very, very deep excursion. Thank you, Leonard. That was very, very impressive and all encompassing. I think intellectually honest. As I said, I love Kamran Vafa. You just want to hug the guy. He's a mensch, but putting that basically on a monolith to me means he's even going beyond QED to saying M theory, string theory is the ultimate theory of nature. And I agree with you 100%. It's far too provisional, at least at this stage. But that's part of my mission on this podcast, is to talk to brilliant theorists like yourself and like Kamran and Shelley Glashow, et cetera, and really understand what makes them tick and survey the landscape, a literal landscape of theoretical physics, so that someday we can think about experiments of everything. We spend a lot of time on theories of everything. I want to do experiments of everything. Okay, so the last question. Now we're going to go back in time. I just took you forward in time 1 billion years. Now I'm going to take you backwards in time, 20 years or 30 years. And that's relates to this so-called third law of Sir Arthur C. Clarke. So the podcast, when it comes out, you'll listen to it. It has Sir Arthur C. Clarke's actual voice saying, any sufficiently advanced technology is indistinguishable from magic. And so we have that as part of our Arthur C. Clarke Center here that I'm the co-director of. His second law is for every expert, there's an equal and opposite expert. I like that. I like to use that in faculty meetings.
Yeah.
And his last law, his third law, so-called third law, is the only way of discovering the limits of the possible is to venture a little way past them into the impossible. And that's the name of this podcast, the Into the Impossible podcast. I want to ask you, what thing about life when you were 20 years old, 30 years old, seemed impossible, but then you did it? And what kind of advice would you give to your past self to go and have the courage to go a little bit into the impossible?
Well, I've had, as you know, quite a checkered career. And when I was, almost everything I've done, I thought was impossible. But I didn't, people at least told me that it was. So when I was starting out in physics, I was told that there were no jobs for theorists. You better become an experimentalist or just do something else because you're wasting your time. And then I managed to get a job as a theorist. And good thing, because as an experimentalist with only these things, thumbs, I wouldn't have gone very far. Then I stopped and decided I wanted to. I've always done physics, and I can publish throughout my career, no matter what I was doing. But I took a break from academic physics, turned it into a hobby, and I said, and I had a tenured position offered. And I turned it down, and I said, no, I'm going to write in Hollywood. And people said, you're crazy. And then I wrote for like 9 years in Hollywood, Star Trek: The Next Generation, MacGyver, the Gary Shandling Show, the old show Night Court. I mean, I did a lot of decent shows. So that was supposed to be impossible. At some point, I quit, and I said, I'm going to write books for a living. And my agent, Susan, if you're listening, she seemed like, what? And that's so, I guess I would say that I wouldn't tell I would just say what I've learned from all this is that, well, maybe I just haven't found the impossible yet. And the important thing is to follow your passions and your dreams, and don't not do it because you're afraid. Don't not do it because you think it's not possible, because look at the different things that I've done, and I really don't have any particular talent in any of it, but I managed to keep doing this and that and do different things, but I just keep pushing, and I always have a plan B. So you don't want to be homeless on the street, have a plan B, but shoot for plan A. That's my advice.
Reach for plan A, but have your for plan B, but have a planet backup beneath you. Anyway,
plan B is fine, and when you're tired of that, you'll find a new plan
A. Leonard Mlodinow, thank you so much for going into the impossible.
Thanks, Brian. It's been fun.
Any sufficiently advanced technology is indistinguishable from magic.